receiving a signal that's bounced off of the ionosphere, back to Earth, off the ionosphere again, and back to Earth, maybe multiple times. Sometimes it's a single hop, sometimes it's a few hops. But the ionosphere is basically a layer of the atmosphere way, way, way up in the outer atmosphere that has particles that get ionized by the radiation from the sun. And it basically creates a reflective layer at different times during the day, and depending on the amount of solar activity that's occurring at the time, and allows different frequencies to reflect or pass through at various times. And at the frequency that Ed was transmitting on, usually, typically they open up at the nighttime. That's very close to the 40-meter ham radio band. So it's a very good evening band, and if you transmit on that, you're very likely, with only a couple of watts, and what is that, a 5-watt radio?
It's actually 10 watts.
10-watt radio.
And I should point out that was not a legal broadcast. This is, unless you're a licensed amateur radio operator, you can't do these types of transmissions. You actually can't broadcast on amateur radio anyway. You have to have an intended one-to-one communication. But so using something like this actually is illegal. So I just wanted to mention that.
So for instance, you can actually communicate all across the world, and that's one of the things that really interests me about amateur radio, is the fact that you can be using radios that are less powerful than some of the handhelds that he was demonstrating that in the city only get you a couple of blocks. You can actually use at lower frequencies to get you literally around the world. So there are a couple of other methods of propagation that are used as well, and on VHF and UHF, there are some tropospheric modes. Which rely on the differences in the index of refraction of various layers because of heat differences and stuff like that actually allow VHF and UHF signals to travel long distances. And what a lot of people used to do before, well, they won't be able to do it after 2009 anyway, but with FMDXing for receiving television signals, VHF and UHF signals from cities many, many miles further than you would normally be able to receive. You know, you can depend on modes like this to actually somewhat unreliably, because they're not as predictable, but they can carry radio waves much further than you would normally get. Sporadic E is another mode which relies on very, very densely ionized patches in the atmosphere to carry VHF and UHF signals, again in the same way that the HF signals are typically carried through the F layer of the ionosphere. So every once in a while you'll be listening to you know, the 2-meter band or the 440-meter band on the amateur radio frequency locations, and you'll hear people from, you know, around here. You might hear someone from Maine, or you might hear someone from Maryland or something, somewhere that you would typically not be able to normally receive, and you can pretty much bet that would be something like sporadic E or a ducting mode that's actually carrying that wave to you. So another thing that really limits your ability to communicate is the absorption characteristics of RF as the frequency increases. So at HF, you can really rely on a lot of ground wave propagation and propagation that's not really interfered with by buildings as much as VHF and UHF frequencies are. So for instance, communicating with a radio like this, you know, from here to maybe the second floor or the lobby might be a little bit difficult because of all of the obstructions in the way. Now, you can't really use HF on a portable radio because as the frequency decreases, the antenna size increases proportionally. But if you had a radio outside with a dipole antenna or with a vertical antenna that was suitable to the frequency that you're using, buildings might not be as much of a problem because you can actually have a takeoff angle that clears those buildings, bounces off the ionosphere, and comes down somewhere else, sometimes predictably, sometimes unpredictably. So, for instance, I've had conversations with people in Germany and Holland and other places in Europe with only 1 or 2 watts. Transmitting power from a crappy antenna in my backyard. Actually, this is a radio that Skip has. This is very common amongst what people call QRP hobbyists in amateur radio. And QRP stands for low power operation, typically less than 5 watts or so. And this is a radio that was actually built in an Altoids can. Do you know what model that is?
That's the Freakmite, I think.
It's
I'm not sure.
Okay. This actually, yeah, it looks like the Rockmite. So a Rockmite is a very popular transceiver that's kitted by, I forget, the K1SWL, is that right?
Yeah.
So he produced all these kits that are very popular, and it's a crystal controlled CW radio. So that means that basically you're limited to using Morse code. But the bandwidth that Morse code uses in relation to other modulation schemes like AM and FM is very low, which really increases the signal to noise ratio and allows you to use really tight filtering to pull in signals that are otherwise incredibly weak. So if you guys want to learn Morse code or use computers to generate and decode it, you can actually even extend the range even further. So
To be licensed as an amateur radio operator in the United States no longer requires the CW test, but CW is still a popular mode for the very reasons Joe just mentioned.
And by the way, there was a, I believe it was on Jay Leno. We might have mentioned this last
oh yeah,
time.
there was a contest.
There was a contest on Jay Leno between the world's fastest text messengers and 2 ham radio operators to see who could get a message across faster with Morse code versus texting.
You're keeping them in suspense.
The SMS guys got completely smoked. Completely smoked, okay? Which begs the question that is Morse code a better way to enter your text message on your cell phone than going around and hunting and pecking for these keys? And so actually I just got, I have to say, I stood in line 2.5 hours to get my iPhone, and there's actually a program that you can input text using Morse code into your iPhone. So, I think it's an interesting, turn of events,
Right.
Where do you plug in the key?
So there's no external key.
So I need a I need a Bluetooth Morse code key now. So
So it's a really efficient mode and really power efficient relative to some of the other modes, because when the transmitter is on, it's transmitting at the full power that the transmitter is capable of, and when it's not, it's completely off. So it's a very power efficient mode. It can really help you communicate far distances with really very. I mean, it defies logic to believe that you can actually build something in a weekend that can communicate thousands and thousands of miles.
It's effectively magic that you can communicate without any infrastructure from one point of the planet to somewhere on the opposite side of the planet using just a tiny battery and an antenna. It's incredible. It's truly magic that you could just a little battery powered thing that you could fit in your hand. You can communicate without any infrastructure around the world. So think about that. And the reliability of being able to use a network that doesn't rely on a corporation or a government agency to maintain.
So real quick, I'm going to go over a couple of the antennas that you can expect to use with some of the HF, what was I saying, W2H, is that right? So this is the radiation pattern of a dipole antenna, and this is looking at the axis of the dipole antenna. So typically these are cut for half a wavelength. So the lower in frequency you go, the larger the antenna is going to be. But they offer pretty predictable radiation patterns, which allows you to set up the antenna so that the radiation pattern is directed toward where you want to communicate. If you go to the next one. Okay, if you add a couple of more elements to a typical dipole antenna, you end up with a directional antenna called a Yagi, and these are really common. You'll see them on rooftops for reception of TV signals. Typically, you can null out signals that are causing interference or undesired, and really concentrate your energy with a high gain, which gives you more power to the intended recipient than a dipole normally would with an antenna like this. They're a little bit bigger and bulkier, especially at the HF frequencies, but they really do help for getting the message where you want it to go in conditions that aren't exactly desirable. Right, the driven element is in the middle, the director's in the front, and the reflector's in the back. Yeah. So the director's a little bit smaller than half wave, and the reflector's a little bit larger.
And other than just being grounded together, they're absolutely not connected. You could just hang a wire
They're
In fact,
passive elements,
I built
yeah,
one that
yeah.
way. I built one in an attic that way, where it was just, you have a director that's a wire behind it, and then you've got the driven element, and then a whole bunch of directors in front of it down the peaks of an attic.
And that's
And it
another
just
aspect of
worked
it.
great.
Typically, you see these things mounted on rooftops, and they're really huge and kind of bulky, and you wouldn't expect to be able to discreetly deploy them anywhere. But actually, you can make these antennas out of 30-gauge magnet wire, which is incredibly hard to see if it's just hanging and you're not looking for it. If you can find a couple of trees that are spaced the way you want it to, you can set up an antenna like this really stealthily. And really nobody would know. I've had an antenna like this at my apartment building, not a Yagi, but an NFED and a couple of dipoles that nobody's ever seen, because the wire that I'm using is so thin, and you can transmit with 100 watts into them easily, and literally communicate around the world. So there were
We're going to talk about rubber ducky?
there were
Or
a
you
couple of
wanna go
yeah, go ahead.
Do you have more?
No, when he's done talking about the rubber ducks, there should be a couple more radiation patterns that you can show depending on.
Okay. When we started talking about this a while ago, the thought experiment was practical use of radio for activists in activist situations. And most gatherings, demonstrations, meetups, mashups, whatever you want, are probably going to take advantage of some of the radios that Bernie was suggesting, GMRS, FRS, or ham radio, or CB, or various things, whatever is available to people. When people gather, they use what they have at hand. But there's a couple things that even though with most of these talkie radios, the common antenna is what we call a rubber ducky. You can see why they do that. But the practical matter of that is that a rubber ducky is a negative gain antenna under most circumstances. So 5 watts in, this radio produces 5 watts. I'm really only getting a radiated power of 1.58. Thanks to Redbird for correcting my math. And the way you see most people operating with them is they hang them on their belt, and then they use well, my body's an attenuator. So I'm cutting down that 1.58 watts that much further, and I'm trying to communicate and keep a group organized to keep them out of trouble. That's problematic. The right way to use a radio like this to get the best use out of it is to do this. Get the radio higher, get the radio away from your body attenuation, and that's what you use the mic for. Just a practical aspect. The other thing you can do with any and this applies to any of these radios if you cut the right frequency, is do what's called a tiger tail. Piece of wire. I'm an old romantic. This is a telephone hookup wire. And you just cut it to a quarter wave and put it around the base section of the ducky. Here I have the figures, 9.5 inches for 2 meters, 6.5 for 440. And that's going to improve the efficiency of the radio as well, even though that's loose and flexible.
You have to wrap it around a bunch of times?
Oh, well, you have to secure it in some way to the ground side.
Not induction.
No, it's actually connected to the ground side. Basically, a rubber ducky is a monopole, one half of a dipole. You're adding the other half of the antenna.
But there's metal there to connect
Yeah.
He's jamming it between the connector, basically.
Yeah,
He's tightening it around that wire.
Let's be practical.
So typically these antennas rely on your body to complete the other half of the antenna, and it doesn't usually work so well in practical situations when it's clipped to your belt.
That might help. Is that upside down or backwards?
So that's the SMA connector on his radio, and what he's doing is actually wrapping that wire around it and then tightening the antenna.
And then I would just screw that in. You can also secure it if you have access to the radio circuit board. You can secure it to the ground side of the antenna. The idea is just to improve your efficiency that little bit. Microphone. To improve that efficiency a little bit, you're going to extend the ability. If you're talking a gathering of people in a public place, you're talking hundreds of yards improvement. But hundreds of yards may be important. The other option is if your radio, some of the FRS, GMRS radios don't have disconnectable antennas, you can make them disconnectable. And they make antennas that do other things to improve efficiency. This is basically a quarter wave at 440, now it's 5/8 wave. You wouldn't walk around carrying this, but if you had to extend your communication for whatever purpose, you can do that. People also make J poles